I came home after a 3-day work trip expecting the usual. Drop my bag, crack open a beer sit under the hedge I'd been shaping for 2 decades. Instead, I walked into a nightmare. My 20-year-old privacy wall, the one I'd trimmed, watered, fertilized, nursed through storms, was hacked down to raw stumps. No warning, no permission, just butchered wood and scattered branches like a crime scene. And as I stood there frozen, my neighbor Vivian stepped into her window frame, arms crossed, smiling like she'd won something. That's when I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a declaration of war. My name's Sullivan Drake. I'm a logistics engineer. I don't work with tiny boxes. I work with the kind of steel containers that carry 10,000 pounds across oceans. I design layouts for ports, calculate load distributions, make sure stacks don't collapse in a storm. My whole world is rules, limits, measurements, and consequences. I never imagined I'd use those same principles to defend my own backyard. But that's how suburbia works sometimes. You think you're buying a quiet street and a simple house. You end up in a political arena run by an HOA, and whatever self-appointed dictator manages to charm or intimidate the board. For us, that person was Vivian Kessler. Late 40s blazer for every occasion, the kind of smile that never touches her eyes. She moved in 6 months before all this, and from day one, she acted like the neighborhood was her personal empire. She suggested paint colors, critiqued mailbox posts, took pictures of people's lawns, and called it maintaining standards. She called herself the vice president of the HOA, even though that position didn't exist. I ignored her at first. I figured she was just another suburban micromanager who needed a hobby, but she zeroed in on my hedge. She said it blocked her view of the hills. I told her politely and with paperwork that the hedge was on my property under the height limit and absolutely compliant. She didn't like that answer. She didn't argue. She just went quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like someone taking notes for later. A week before my work trip, I got a message from her asking me to cut it down for the sake of the community view. I declined. She didn't reply. At that point, I honestly thought she'd move on to harassing someone else. I had no idea how far she'd go. When I pulled into my driveway after being gone just 3 days, the first thing I noticed was silence. Not peaceful silence, wrong silence. The kind where something's missing. I walked to the backyard and stopped dead. 20 years of growth reduced to ugly, oozing stumps. Chunks of branches everywhere. A faint smell of gasoline from a chainsaw. And the view straight into Vivian's living room where she stood in full display, arms folded, watching me absorb the damage. When our eyes met, she smiled, a slow, victorious smile that made my hands shake. I tried to keep my cool. I knocked on her door. She opened it with that same smug expression and said, "Oh, Sullivan." The HOA addressed overgrowth concerns. You should read the covenant. Like she'd just done me a favor. Like my property, the thing I'd cared for, was an inconvenience she had finally removed. The fury in my chest didn't even have words yet. I just went home, sat at my laptop, and pulled up the HOA portal. No meetings mentioned my hedge, no vote, no authorization, nothing. She'd acted alone, then slapped the HOA label on her stunt to cover herself. That night I barely slept. I was angry, but underneath that anger was something heavier, doubt. I kept thinking, is this even worth fighting? Maybe I should just let it go. Maybe resisting her will make life miserable. And the worst part? For a moment I believed that. It's easy to think you're overreacting when the whole neighborhood seems content to let someone like her run the show. But the next morning, sunlight hit those jagged stumps like a punch in the throat. That hedge wasn't just decoration, it was my boundary, my privacy, my space. And she walked all over it because she thought I'd just roll over. So I filed a formal complaint. The HOA thanked me for bringing it up, then told me I'd need to wait 30 to 45 days for review. In other words, get in line, don't expect much, and please stop making noise. That's when the hopelessness hit for real. I felt powerless, outnumbered, outmaneuvered by someone who didn't even follow rules, but weaponized them. I remember sitting at my kitchen table thinking, what if they all side with her? What if all this paperwork is pointless? What if I'm just the crazy neighbor who won't comply? But later that same day, while rereading zoning codes for the 10th time, something clicked. I noticed a section about temporary storage structures, no foundation, under 14 feet tall, not blocking emergency access, allowed for 90 days without any HOA approval. And I swear I felt a spark light inside me, because I know temporary storage structures better than anyone in a 5-mile radius. Shipping containers, steel fortresses, weathered giants built to survive storms. I opened my notebook and began sketching. 8 containers, 40 feet each, 9.5 feet tall, placed side by side along our property line. Entirely legal, completely within my right, and tall enough to erase her precious view for months. It wasn't revenge, it was equilibrium. I called a container leasing company I'd worked with professionally. By Saturday morning at 7 a.m., a convoy of flatbeds and a crane rolled down my street. The moment the crane extended its arm, I saw Vivian burst out her front door in a panic, wearing a robe and slippers, shouting into her phone. She looked like someone watching their kingdom crumble. The crane operator lifted the first container like an offering to the gods of justice. It swung gently in the morning air, then landed on the gravel bed I'd prepped the day before with a satisfying metallic thud. By the time the second container was set, Vivian was on the phone with the city. By the third, she'd called the county. By the fourth, she was pacing with her hair sticking out and her voice cracking. None of her calls mattered. I had documentation for everything, and every official who showed up said the same thing. This is compliant. For once I wasn't the one being cornered. She was. Next came the emergency HOA meeting. Vivian marched into that room dressed like she was about to prosecute me in federal court. She brought charts, photos, and a printed real estate appraisal claiming my containers reduced property values. I sat there calmly with my folder of codes and measurements while she ranted about industrial blight and community character. When she finished, I simply raised my hand and read aloud the exact covenant she had violated when she chopped down my hedge without notice. Then something unexpected happened. The room turned on her. People she'd intimidated for months started speaking. The man whose trash cans she reported. The woman whose garden shed she threatened. The elderly neighbor she forced to hire a surveyor just to prove her wrong. Complaint after complaint poured out until even Marshall, the soft-spoken HOA president, snapped. He held up a folder with 14 written grievances, 14 filed in just 6 months. For once, he wasn't timid. He looked her straight in the eye and said, "Vivian, this isn't enforcement. This is harassment." And then the board voted, 5-0. Vivian Kessler suspended for 6 months from every committee and every HOA meeting. Her face when the vote passed, I'll never forget it. It was the face of someone who finally realized the rules she hid behind were bigger than her. A few days later, a letter arrived from a law firm. Vivian was offering a settlement reimbursement for the hedge compensation for damages and a promise to behave if I removed the containers within 30 days. I declined. Instead, I sent back 3 conditions. First, she had to write a public apology to the entire neighborhood. Second, the HOA had to implement new policies requiring written notice and board approval for any action affecting private property. Third, the containers stayed for the full 90 days, no negotiation. To my surprise, her lawyer called back saying she'd accept. 3 days later, a letter signed by Vivian was posted publicly. It was stiff, forced, absolutely dripping with humiliation, but it was an admission. She'd violated procedure. She'd overstepped. She was wrong. That alone was worth more than the settlement check. For the next 3 months, she lived with a rusted steel wall blocking her view. Every morning when she opened her curtains, she saw the consequences of her own arrogance. Every time she walked past her window, she saw the result of underestimating someone who knew how to read a regulation manual. Eventually, the 90 days ended. The crane came back. The containers were lifted away one by one. When the last one left the ground, the space felt clean, controlled, mine again. I planted bamboo along the property line, 40 stalks spaced perfectly. It'll grow tall, lush, and permanent. A natural wall, a peaceful one, a legal one. A week later, I saw Vivian at the grocery store. She didn't scowl, she didn't glare, she didn't even speak. She just walked past me quietly like someone who'd finally learned there are limits even for self-appointed tyrants. And that's where this story ends. Not with applause, not with a celebration. just a boundary restored and a bully stripped of her power. Because in neighborhoods, just like in shipping yards, stability comes from understanding the rules, not abusing them. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the form of 8 steel containers and someone who finally says, "Enough." Lesson learned: when someone weaponizes rules against you, the smartest response is to know those rules better than they do.